Hey everybody, this is Joel with a special edition of Red Rondo in an episode that we are calling the Big Interview with James Pearce. It has been, to say the least, a very interesting time for Liverpool throughout the Premier League and the Champions League campaign. And we are very pleased to have on somebody who knows a lot about Liverpool. He follows it for a living. He is a correspondent for the Athletic. You can also hear him on the Athletic's Walk On podcast. And he's the author of a new highly successful book called Walk On Inside Arne Slot's Liverpool. I'm very pleased to have James Pearce on the program. James, thanks for being here.
Good to be on, Joel. Thanks for having me.
A pleasure. So, like I said, there's plenty of things. It's been a bit of a roller coaster if you go back from the start of the season until right now with Liverpool, to say the least. There's a lot to dissect. It's very difficult. I think maybe first to begin with, let's go to when it was maybe a little bit more harmonious, maybe more optimism among Liverpool fans and Liverpool people at the beginning of the season. They signed Florian Wirtz. They brought in Jeremy Frimpong. They made huge signings. Many of them were getting ratings of like 10 out of 10. Hugo Ekitike, Alexander Isak. Before the start of the season, was Liverpool basically setting themselves up for like a Premier League or bust? Was that kind of the standard for them at the start of this season?
No, I wouldn't say it was kind of win the league or bust. I think it was obviously there was a huge investment in the squad. I mean, 450 million pounds worth if you include all the various kind of performance related add-ons in the deal, made it the most extravagant spending spree in Liverpool's history. And of course, there was an awful lot of players going the other way as well. 250 million pounds worth of players were sold. So it was historic in terms of how much went on, but it was certainly speaking to people internally at the club, it was about the long term. I don't think anyone realistically thought that there would be that amount of change and that suddenly everything would just click immediately. I just don't think. I think we've all probably watched enough top level sport to know that major changes usually bring with it periods of transition and adaptation in the same way as a year ago when Arne Slot first took over as Liverpool manager, one of the things he really benefited from was continuity and stability in the squad, and everyone knew their roles and everyone knew each other. And there was, apart from Federico Chiesa, there was no one adapting to a new country, a new language, a new way of working. But so it has been a difficult period, but it certainly hasn't shaken the belief, I'd say, certainly, in the hierarchy at the club in what they did last summer. They still believe in what they did and the deals they pulled off. It's just that, a lot of those names you mentioned, Isak and Wirtz are obviously the two biggest standout ones because they cost the most money, and you'd have to say that neither of them so far have lived up to the kind of expectation levels. But of course, those players were bought for the long term. They weren't just bought for the first kind of 6 months.
But I guess let's talk about the long-term thing, because I think one of the more interesting dilemmas, obviously, it was fine earlier in the season. They had won their first few matches. They were in first place. Everything seemed good. In retrospect, if you look at the games as a whole, they were very, very shaky, sort of defensively, but the results were there. And I think when the results are there, the heat is off to a certain extent for the likes of an Arne Slot. Now there is more heat on him. Does Arne Slot, I think his dilemma right now is, do you continue to try to integrate those players that are still maybe adjusting to life at Liverpool, like the Florian Wirtzes and the Frimpong and maybe Isak when he's back healthy and everything like that? Or do you have to prioritize getting results and making sure that at worst you finish in the first four for Europe, and maybe you go back to a traditional lineup that brought them success against the Real Madrids and Aston Villas?
Yeah, I think I think he's provided a pointer for us really in those games before the international break in terms of he has reverted back, hasn't he, to more of the kind of the tried and trusted, experienced stars that were so influential in that title triumph last season. You think of, kind of ditching really the having Wirtz as part of a three-man midfield, going back to, Gravenberch, Szoboszlai, McAllister, that trio was so influential last season. And you'd have to say it really worked against Aston Villa. It worked against Real Madrid. I thought the Real Madrid game was the most complete performance Liverpool have produced probably since they demolished Tottenham to clinch the title back in April. And then of course, the change at left back in those same three games that I mentioned. It's Kirkez. There's no getting away from the fact that he endured a really tough opening 3 months for his Liverpool career. I think, yes, he had a great season for Bournemouth, but it just shows the size of the step up. And I know it's the same, it sounds stupid in a way because it's the same league, but it's so different. The pressure and scrutiny and expectation that come with playing for a global institution the size of Liverpool compared to playing for Bournemouth week in, week out. So, we've seen him go back to Andy Robertson. And again, that worked in the two games against Villa and Real Madrid. It didn't work against Man City, but that was a collective issue. That was Liverpool. You can point to controversial decisions, and I'm still scratching my head over how on earth that Virgil van Dijk header was disallowed because it was a ridiculous decision at the time, I thought, and I was convinced VAR would overturn it. And then when you then listen to the explanation with the audio being made public and Howard Webb trying to justify it on TV, it just leaves me even more baffled because it was a bad mistake at a crucial time. But you also, I think, you have to hold your hands up and say Liverpool were comprehensively outplayed. I think the important thing for Slot is he needs to try and cling to the positives of what he saw against Villa and what he saw against Real Madrid. And probably you almost have to try and write off that Man City game, I think, because also as poor as Liverpool were on the day, and they looked worryingly tired to me at the Etihad in terms of they didn't really compete physically with City. But City were outstanding, and there are a lot more, kinder fixtures coming up after this break for Liverpool, and they have to get some momentum because I think realistically, the title just isn't going to happen for Liverpool this season. I think to have lost 5 out of 11 already, but that doesn't mean that this can't be a special season. There's no reason why they can't go a long, long way in the Champions League, especially they've already got one foot in the knockout stages with 3 wins out of 4 in the league stage, and the way that things are at the minute, with new players bedding in, it wouldn't surprise me if Liverpool are a much stronger force in that second half of the season.
Now, let's talk a little bit about Arne Slot because last season, I think it was probably the ideal scenario when he knew he was coming into that. Filling in for a club legend in Jurgen Klopp is no easy feat. You can just look at the faces that have replaced Man United legends from way back when, from Matt Busby to Sir Alex Ferguson and so on. So it is by no means an easy task to step into that. Just about everything went Liverpool's way, though, and went Arne Slot's way last season. This season, it's been different. His tactical moves, especially when Liverpool have a setback, he seems a little bit. Am I wrong in assuming that when things aren't going Liverpool's way, which they haven't for quite a while now, that Arne Slot seems a little bit lost and unsure about what to do? Maybe because last season he just didn't have those dilemmas and those decisions to have to make.
Yeah, I think there's definitely an element of that. I think, certainly last season it felt for so long that he had the Midas touch in terms of it just seemed that everything that he did worked. And, I think we can all point to lots of games where Liverpool maybe weren't great in the first half, yet, little tactical tweaks that he made at half time, intelligent substitutions completely changed the complexion of a game, and Liverpool won at a canter this time around. It's been elusive in terms of finding answers to problems, and the issues have kept on stacking up for him. I think that was the thing last season. He had a core of kind of 13, 14 players that he really, really trusted. Everyone knew exactly what their role was. There were very few injury issues. And because they started well, belief and confidence just grew and grew. Of course, this time around, the opposite's been true. You've got key personnel who their standards have dipped. Of course, as you mentioned at the start of the season, Liverpool were winning games without playing particularly well. And of course, the narrative tends to be, well, that's the sign of champions. You can win without being at your best. But the only problem with that is it's not sustainable because you can't keep on being average and winning because eventually it's going to catch up with you. And that's exactly rather than performance levels improving, they actually probably got worse and they end up, on a really dismal run of results. So yeah, and then on top of that, of course, he's got the issue of so many new players not being able to hit the ground running. You'd say only Ekatike has been a revelation really. I absolutely love watching him, but you'd have to say only him really. And I suppose Mamadashvili I think has got better during his spell deputising for Allison. But the rest of the new guys haven't done themselves justice for different reasons. I think Wirtz has looked better in the Champions League, which I don't think is any great coincidence. The slightly different style and pace and physicality of those games seems to suit him better than the Premier League so far. Isak. When you think of how much excitement that deal generated when he completed that move on deadline day, it was almost like, wow, Slot's got this embarrassment of riches now. Yet, we're sat here in the middle of November and Alexander Isak doesn't have a Premier League goal to his name. And I wouldn't be too hard on him because I think everything that surrounded his move to Liverpool suggested it was always going to take time because he hadn't had a proper pre-season. He'd missed out on so much game time at the friendlies and then the start of the season. But of course, the hope was that by October he'd be up to speed and unlike someone like Wirtz, Isak isn't, he's not young in football terms. What is he, 26? He was Premier League proven. You would have thought by now he'd be showing everyone what he can do, but he hasn't been able to because just when he was getting himself into, the kind of shape physically where Slot felt he could play 2 games in 3 or 4 days, he broke down, does his groin, and it felt like it was back to square one. So yeah, I think, inevitably when you're Liverpool manager and you lose, what is it, 7 out of 10 games, you know that there's going to be flack flying around and you're going to be criticised. But it hasn't kind of shaken my belief in Slot. I think, there's such a knee-jerk reaction in modern football these days where sometimes you have to take a step back and remind yourself this is the guy that won Liverpool the Premier League, exceeding all expectations, 6 months ago. So he deserves to be given some time and to be cut some slack.
Now, you mentioned an embarrassment of riches. I think it's obvious to everybody Arne Slot's embarrassment of riches in the attack. All the names that you mentioned, Ekatike, Isak, Florian Wirtz. We haven't even mentioned Mohamed Salah.
Mm.
But like you look at the opposite side of things, and that's obviously gotten its share of criticism, is the back line. I think it's very different for Arne Slot because he's kind of, as the British say, he's kind of buggered when it comes to the back line. He doesn't have an array of different options. So like Konate's had his share of struggles. You mentioned Milos Kerkez. What does Arne Slot do? Does he and the club have to be desperate and maybe make a big move and overspend for a Mark Gahey if they can again um, at the transfer window? What can he do to improve that back line because he's limited in his options in for defensively?
Yeah, he is, and of course that kind of situation was made worse by Leone rupturing his ACL on his debut. That was brutal misfortune, and of course it goes back to what I said in the last answer about that just didn't really happen to Liverpool last season. They were their fitness record was incredible, and then to lose the young talented Italian centre back you bring in on his debut like that was a real bitter pill to swallow. And then you mentioned, Kanate was so influential last season in terms of winning the league, but he's been nowhere near it. I think he's been, I would say, erratic is probably the best way of describing him because I think he has had games where I've thought, yeah, he's back. He's kind of that's the level we kind of expect from Kanate. I thought he was excellent against Arsenal, excellent against Real Madrid. I think Merseyside derby springs to mind as well. But there's been other times where he's made so many basic errors that have really hurt Liverpool. The game at the Etihad against Man City last weekend was the perfect example of that. You think to yourself, well, surely giving away the penalty. Well, he didn't give away the penalty, but you know what I mean. He made his mistake leads to Mamadashvili giving away the penalty. You think, well, surely that's a wake-up call for him. Yeah, he makes an absolute hash of dealing with that cross that Haaland heads home for the first goal. He has to deal with that. He doesn't really get off the ground. I don't know what he's thinking. It seems like he's almost trying to flick it on rather than just get off his feet and head it to safety. And that kind of sums up where he's at the moment. And of course, I think that's also compounded by the fact that Slot seems, in my judgment, strangely reluctant to turn to Joe Gomez. I think there's been times, certainly when Liverpool have been playing 3 games in a week, with Konaté's form being so patchy, that I've thought, well, surely Gomez gets a game and, starts alongside Van Dijk. But again, he's been reluctant to do that, and it does make you scratch your head a bit and think, well, if he doesn't really have that full belief in Gomez, then Liverpool really should have pushed the boat out more for Mark Gay at the back end of the summer window, because the feeling internally was that, well, we want a young centre back to replace Kwanzaa, who of course left for Leverkusen, and it was like, Leone fitted the bill, and Mark Gay would have been a kind of almost like an addition to the plan if they could have got him, because of course 1 year left on his deal, he was relatively cheap. As we all know, 35 million pound deal was agreed. Palace pulled the plug at the 11th hour. But yeah, I think at the moment, not getting Gay, looks like, it is hurting Liverpool. And yeah, lots of people asking me whether I think he'll become a Liverpool player in January. I think it's going to be difficult, I think, to get him in January, because because it's Liverpool to even have a chance of getting him. Liverpool are going to have to pay over the odds, because if you're Palace, I don't get the impression of Palace at all that they feel under any pressure to sell him in January. And of course, if Palace are still, if they're still in Europe, if they're still potentially competing for a European qualification spot via their Premier League position, the value of keeping Mark Gay until the end of the season, could well be, more to them to keep him than it would be to sell him. And it's like, well, how much would Liverpool pay for him? I don't, people say, well, 20 million, but would Liverpool really pay 20 million for someone who's free 5 months later? I've got, to me, that doesn't smack like a Michael Edwards type deal, and we know how he goes about things. So, Liverpool might have to wait to the summer. And of course, as a free agent, Mark Gay will have all kinds of options from around Europe. The only thing I think that counts in Liverpool's favour is, I get the impression that he's a kind of a loyal type of guy who, he clearly had his heart set on joining Liverpool at the end of August. And Liverpool will hope that kind of position remains unchanged, because of course it didn't fall through any fault of Liverpool. It was very much from the Palace end.
Well, on the signings front, I guess one of the big points of contention for the season, and it's going to be as the season progresses and we get closer to the end of the campaign, is going to be Ibrahima Konaté's contract situation. How do you see that going as things stand right now? You said Slot really seems to like him. Do you see them making a long-term commitment, especially with the form that Konate has, if that continues?
Yeah, I think the last I heard, there were like talks between Kanate's people and the club were continuing, and they were cordial, and trying to find a compromise. Clearly, there was, you go back to the back end of last season, there was a big gap between what he wanted and what the club were willing to offer. 'Cause I think it must be about a year ago now, when Liverpool kind of opened preliminary discussions about an extension. So yeah, I think it's a difficult one to call at the minute. We know there's interest from Real Madrid. I don't think Kanate's done himself too many favors so far this season in terms of convincing anyone that, they to really push the boat out for him. I think, I think it says a lot, the fact that Kanate's future, if you compare it to, how the futures of Salah and Van Dijk and Alexander-Arnold were dominating the conversation a year ago. We're now in a situation where Konate could sign a pre-contract agreement with a club overseas and it's got to be probably less than 50 days now. Yet it's not really talked about that much, because his form has been so patchy this season that I don't think there would be a big kind of outcry if he did announce he was going to leave. It would create a headache for Liverpool in so much as, they'd go from needing to recruit one centre back to probably needing to get two. But yeah, I think Kanate, I'd still like to see him stay. But of course, I think we all know with these kind of sagas that especially, and it's different because I know that Van Dijk and Salah signed extensions late in the season. It was April, wasn't it, last season? But they're both in the twilight of their careers. Kanate's situation has got a lot more in common with Alexander Arnold in terms of a player in his prime coming into being a free agent, and usually when it gets down to the last 5 or 6 months, usually that results in a player moving on. So I would say if my kind of hunch on it would be if Kanate hasn't signed a new deal by January, then I think he probably will end up leaving at the end of the season because I think well by the time January comes, just financially the kind of offers he'll have on the table will because with no transfer fee, you're talking about being able to pocket a huge signing on fee as well as big wages.
Now, one of the players that is committed for the long term, that is already locked in and is going to be a big part of the Liverpool plans, is going to be Florian Wirtz. We have to touch on his form. I guess one thing I noted is it was earlier this week, his German manager, Julian Nagelsmann, talked about maybe there being a case of too many players want to be kind of the star thing. Can you pinpoint what is it about Florian Wirtz that he's not contributing, particularly in the Premier League right now?
Yeah, I think it is the pace and the physicality of the Premier League, which it is different to the Bundesliga and the intensity of the games. And I think it's also made more difficult this season by the general shift in approach of so many teams because he in a way he's had the misfortune to come into the Premier League at the exact time where so many more teams are going direct. There's so many more long balls. It's so much more about set pieces and long throws and playing for second balls. And of course, that isn't Florian Wirtz's game. And that's not to say that he can't flourish in the Premier League because I think he will do. I think he's absolutely elite, and I think sometimes people have to remember he's because I think some people just look at the price tag and think, well, 116 million pound deal, you should be doing more, and I just think that's a little bit too simplistic because he's 22. He'd never lived outside of his homeland, Germany, before. As I said, the contrast with the Premier League compared to the Bundesliga, and also trying to make his mark in a team that hasn't been functioning very well. I think it would be easier if he was coming into a team that was absolutely flying and confidence was high, and that's a lot easier to navigate as a new player. But he's not, and it's the team hasn't been functioning well in any department really for big chunks of this season. So, and I thought Nagelsmann's comments were it was interesting. I mean, he was basically blaming a lot of other Liverpool players for Wirtz, not having Premier League goals or assists to his name so far this season. And but I think that's just that didn't bother me because I just think well I think that's quite shrewd man management because if you're Nagelsmann all you want to ensure is that Wirtz has got the right mindset to deliver for his country during this international break. And I think that was Nagelsmann's way of like putting his arm around his shoulder and telling him, don't worry, everything's going to be all right. It's not your fault. When I think the reality is it's been a collective thing. I think, I don't think Wirtz come close to doing himself justice so far. But I've also got a lot of sympathy for him because, like I said, it's not been an easy time to establish yourself in the team. I quite liked seeing him off the left. I thought it worked well against Real Madrid. It worked less well at City, but I'd like to see Slot persevere with that because I think that the issue with having him as the number 10 in a three-man midfield was that it just left Liverpool too open in terms of teams being able to play through them.
Now it's interesting because like that was going to be one of my next points is he talked so much about Wirtz being so versatile, capable of playing many different positions at Bayer Leverkusen. Um, Mohamed Salah is soon going to be leaving for the Africa Cup of Nations.
Yeah.
Is there going to be more of a dependency, or is this kind of the moment when Salah is gone where Wirtz has to take this team a little bit more on his shoulders and show what he's capable of?
Yeah, well, that it's going to be a period where, especially the intensity of that Christmas period with, the number of games, and, it's a time when you can generate great momentum, and Liverpool certainly needs some of that at the moment. So yeah, I mean, Slot did play him off the right, didn't he? I think Frankfurt away in the Champions League, and that was probably one of his most productive nights in a Liverpool shirt so far. So he is an option in that Salah position. I think also hopefully by the time Salah goes to AFCON, Jeremy Frimpong should be fully fit and back up to speed. And certainly when they bought Frimpong, the message from the recruitment guys was that he was never viewed as like the Alexander Arnold replacement. They felt they already had Alexander Arnold's replacement in Conor Bradley. Frimpong, the attraction of bringing him in was that he was a versatile right-sided player, and that part of that was filling in for Salah, on the right wing when he was away at AFCON. Chiesa can also play wide right as well, and it's funny really because I think in previous years because Salah almost has had that goal scoring burden, on his shoulders to such a huge degree that there was this almost like fear of how on earth are we going to cope without him. Where of course this time around, he again, he hasn't come anywhere close to the heights we come to expect from him. I think he got 5 goals at this stage of the season. He had 10 at the same stage a year ago. The people are talking about Salah's lack of kind of what he gives you defensively in terms of out of possession, and of course, I don't think his defensive work has really changed from last season. I think what has changed is Liverpool just aren't dominating games to the same degree, and he's not making those kind of match-winning contributions that, of course, when he does that, nobody, when you're winning games, no one really looks at the defensive side of his game. So yeah, I think Slot. I'm not too worried about AFCON in terms of the impact because I do think, especially, the big thing for me, can they get Frimpong back fit? Because we haven't really seen hardly anything of him so far. To get 2 hamstring injuries in your first 3 months of the club, he's had a lot of bad luck.
And I think from what I understand too, getting back to your point about Salah, is that when Arne Slot came in, he asked him, from my understanding, to hold back a little bit on a little bit more of his defensive responsibilities, focus more on the attack. And we saw the campaign that he had in that respect. I guess touching on Salah, when you come off a campaign that he had in the Premier League, leading the Premier League in assists and in goals, this season he's been, I would say, a little bit detached at times, particularly in their Premier League fixtures. How much of that do you attribute to the new faces and maybe a lack of familiarity with kind of his surroundings on the pitch from this season as opposed to last?
Yeah, I think that's been a big part of it. I think, you know, pretty much for his entire Liverpool career up to this season, he'd been used to having Trent Alexander-Arnold for company on that right-hand side, and we know how well, they linked and the understanding between them. Again, the relationships between him and the midfield and, the front line in terms of, Darwin Núñez and Luis Diaz and of course, Diogo Jota, the tragic loss of him in the summer. So there's change, it means that you're trying to build new relationships, aren't you? So and you think so far this season there's been a lot of chopping and changing at right back. Conor Bradley obviously missed a big chunk of pre-season, so it's only really in the last couple of weeks that we've seen kind of him fully fit. As I said before, Frimpong, you know, in and out because of injury issues. Gomez has obviously had, a brief stint there as well. So that, it's I don't think that helps. And like I said, the team not functioning particularly well as well. And I think you're right. It was Salah has been isolated. I know there was a piece on the Athletic today written by a couple of my colleagues, and a lot of the data just underlines that in terms of he's having a lot less, fewer touches per 90 minutes. He's not seeing the ball in as many dangerous areas as previously. He's having fewer attempts on goal. Um, and yeah, it's been a cool start for him. And of course, inevitably, when you're 33, people start to ask, well, is that the kind of the beginning of the end in terms of being at the absolute highest level? I'd still say 11 games into the season is a bit too soon to be making sweeping statements like that. But but yeah, I think he's cut a frustrated figure at times this season, Salah. More than anything, he'll know like he prides himself so much on delivering, being the talisman, being the match winner, stepping up when Liverpool need him. And for a whole host of reasons, he hasn't been able to do that so far.
And I want to touch back on Mohamed Salah leaving for AFCON very soon. I guess when he is away, is that the time where Liverpool fans are going to get a glimpse into what the future for the club is going to look like?
I think so, yeah. Yeah, like I said, it's going to be intriguing to see how Slot does handle it because he does have lots of options. As I said, with whether he does play Chiesa there, whether he does play Frimpong there, Wirtz is an option there. He might also go back to that system he played away to Frankfurt, where if you can get, we're talking about what, a month's time, aren't we? So by then you'd like to think Alexander Isak is certainly back up to speed, and if is he going to play Isak and Hugo Ekitike together, and almost it was like a bit of a slightly tweaked 4-4-2 almost that he played that night in Frankfurt, and I think a lot of people would like to see that. It would be exciting to see Isak and Ekitike unleashed together if they can get some kind of double act going. And then, of course, that kind of lends itself then to a different profile of player kind of on the right hand side because in terms of you need someone who really is going to work back if you're going to have two central strikers. So yeah, I think we all kind of knew when Salah signed that 2-year contract in April that we were witnessing certainly at the most probably the last 2 seasons of Salah in a Liverpool shirt, and that evolution into the next phase without him is going to be one of the biggest challenge that Slot faces, in terms of how he kind of handles that transition. Because we've seen already this season, Salah being left out of games that previously it just wouldn't have even been part of the conversation, the idea of going into it without him.
And you brought up Hugo Ekitike. I would say that he has probably been, by a decent stretch, probably the best of the newcomers for Liverpool throughout this season. I was personally concerned. I follow a lot of Ligue 1, and I remember his time at Paris Saint-Germain, where he was kind of lost in the shuffle. I was a little bit concerned that that might happen at Liverpool. How has he been able to almost seamlessly adjust to Premier League life as opposed to the likes of Kerkez, the likes of Wirtz, and the other newcomers who are taking a little bit longer?
Yeah, I think it's difficult. It's a difficult one to answer, really, why he's been able to kind of flourish where others have kind of stuttered. Yeah, I mean, I think it probably. I think he's kind of talked himself about how coming off the back of such a great season for Frankfurt that he arrived here with a real kind of swagger and a confidence, and he felt as if he'd watched a lot of Premier League and thought that it suited him, and I think that's part of it in terms of he's got the frame, the physicality to handle himself. I don't think there's been any shock to him in terms of dealing with the style difference of coming to the Premier League. That's a big thing. I also think, that kind of just the personality of him, where maybe some players, I'd say Frimpong maybe would be one, not Frimpong, but I'd say Kerkez would be an example of someone who looks to me like, just everything that comes with playing for a club the size of Liverpool looks like a bit of a culture shock. I think Ekitike is, he just seems he's such a kind of laid back guy with this kind of belief within him that means he's just taking it in his stride, and he doesn't, I think he looks to me, Ekitike, like a man who thinks, yeah, I belong here, where maybe a couple of others are looking around and thinking, well, this is a big step up. And of course, it helps with Ekitike the fact that he scored goals, pretty much from the word go because as an attacking player, that then just gives you that momentum, and certainly off the pitch as well. Being good mates with Kanate, who I know gave him a lot of help in terms of where to live, and he moved into Luis Diaz's old house on the one of the suburbs of Liverpool, and so I think yeah, everything is just kind of slotted into place for Ekitike in a way that the other new guy is probably looking at him and thinking, why couldn't my first 3 or 4 months at the club have been the same as that?
And it's the things that haven't really slotted in for quite some time has been the back line. We touched on that a little bit. It's really difficult to pinpoint the flaws of the back line because I feel like there are, if you're a tactician or if you're an analyst and things like that, you can pick out like you can
Yeah.
lose count of the amount of them. But I guess one that really stands out to me is their inability to defend set pieces. Is that maybe in retrospect probably the easiest, most fixable things of their defensive flaws?
Yeah, I think so because at times it's been basics. I think that's the thing. It's not like it's some ingenious move that an opponent has come up with that is kind of like outfox them. I think you think of the long throw at Palace, when they conceded that late winner, and that was infuriating. That was players vacating their positions before the ball had been cleared and not dealing with something which should have been dealt with. Even for me, the second goal at Man City last weekend, where just the lack of awareness and the lack of organisation to close down. It was, you can say it's unlucky because Nico Gonzalez's shot obviously takes a deflection off Van Dijk, but there was a few Liverpool players in front of Van Dijk who should have got closer, should have closed that ball down. So yeah, there's a lot that can be improved on that front. I think reacting as well quicker to second balls because that's been another issue. But yeah, defend. I think the thing is when you watch Liverpool and when especially when they've conceded goals on the counter attack, you think it is too easy to just point the finger at Kanate, or at Kirkez, who obviously they've probably been the two defenders who you'd say have struggled more than anyone so far this season. Because at times, what's caused Liverpool problems defensively is they haven't pressed well enough. And obviously, we all know if you don't press well enough, if you press half-heartedly or if it's slightly out, suddenly teams play through you, and the defense is exposed in a way that it just wasn't exposed last season. And the same in midfield. I'd say it's hurt Liverpool defensively so far this season that McAllister's been nowhere near the level of last season. I think, and again, I didn't think he was great at the Etihad, but the same could be said for pretty much all of them. But against Villa and against Real Madrid, there were promising signs of McAllister getting back to where he was. So I think, yeah, I wouldn't just point the finger at the centre halves or the fullbacks. I think collectively Liverpool haven't been good enough out of possession because that was for me one of the biggest things Slot was able to change last season was he made Liverpool a lot more compact, and a lot more secure when they didn't have the ball, and that's what he needs to get back to.
This is gonna probably sound like a very general and probably common sense take, but I guess if you assess Liverpool as a whole, one thing that I mean is obvious, and you're obviously not going to win matches when you're not winning your duels. That's a fairly simplistic, I would say, analogy. But is it just a simple like take or assessment like that that Slot needs to get his team to focus on is just win your duels because it feels almost like the same thing as like, well, if you're not going to score, you're not going to win. Is it as simple as something like that?
Yeah, I think there's certainly been games this season where Liverpool have been bullied a bit, and yeah, competing physically, is a big part of it. Especially again, it goes back to what I said before about the way the Premier League has gone this season with so many teams favouring a more direct approach. I think Slot referenced it in a press conference recently in terms of just how many long balls Liverpool have faced compared to the same stage last season. And Liverpool aren't a massive team, are they, physically? When you think of them, obviously in terms of also in terms of like the profile of player they signed this summer. Kirkez, I'd say, is quite small for a fullback. Frimpong is similar. Wirtz obviously isn't a big guy. McAllister isn't someone who's gonna, you know, win towering headers. So, and if you don't win the initial challenge, like I said before, then a big part of it is reacting to those second balls. And of course, the other thing is you sometimes you can avoid a lot of duels by just keeping the ball better. Because of course, if you're not keeping the ball well enough, you're giving it back to them, then that leads to the creation of more duels. And so I think it's just, those sloppy errors that we've seen too much of this season. It all just feeds into, these problems that Liverpool have had. And of course, because they've been starting games slowly, too often they've conceded the first goal, and we all know that then changes the dynamic. Because if you concede the first goal, then teams can sit back. They probably go even longer against you, because they've got something to hold on to, and they just want to get the ball as far away from their penalty box as they can. And then of course, Slot's then chasing the game, and that's probably one of the reasons as well why he hasn't been able to find a lot of the answers like he did last season, was because he's having to chase the game so much and taking risks that inevitably, sometimes they come off and sometimes they don't.
And Slot, I think, doesn't get as much credit as he deserves for winning last season. I think it was Sol Campbell who said maybe a month or a few weeks ago that he was lucky, basically inherited the Jurgen Klopp era team from last season. I guess I personally look at some of the guys that improved under him, like Ryan Gravenberch in particular, who really took a gigantic step. Konate as well had a great campaign last season.
Yeah.
What does Slot need to do between now and the end of the campaign to take maybe a little bit? Because there is probably there's some grace because he is still took them to the Premier League. They're doing okay in the Champions League right now. They're in a top eight position. What does Slot need to do to ensure that there isn't an outside pressure on him to potentially get sacked by the end of the season? By the end of the season, yeah.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I mean, going back to what you said on Sol Campbell, I mean, I've seen people say similar things, especially on social media, as if all he did was win the league with Klopp's team. But I mean, that argument is nonsensical, because for a start, Klopp didn't win the league in his last season, and lots of players had lost their way towards the back end of that season when it unravelled. And you mentioned Gravenberch there. It was Slot who reinvented him as a number six. Let's not forget that everyone was losing their heads when Liverpool failed to sign Zubimendi and thought, how can Liverpool possibly achieve anything without buying a specialist holding midfielder? And then they did what they did. Playing Luis Diaz as a false nine, and just Szoboszlai was another one who was absolutely reinvigorated by Slot's method. So I think it's massively disrespectful for anyone to suggest that he somehow just got lucky. He'd be the first to acknowledge that, of course, he inherited a very good squad, but he got much, much more out of them and developed them with both his man management and his tactical acumen as a coach. And I think, I've obviously recently released a book called Walk On Inside Arne Slot's Liverpool that focuses on that transitional period from, how on earth did Liverpool go from Klopp to Slot? How was it so seamless? Because of course, it's so much change behind the scenes with Michael Edwards coming back, Richard Hughes being appointed sporting director, and then Slot himself in terms of his methods. And I think there's a lot in that book that kind of explains why internally, forget the outside noise, there's no pressure on Slot internally, in terms of there's actually just a huge amount of sympathy for him in terms of what he's had to contend with since Liverpool won the Premier League. And some people will dismiss it as an excuse, but I think you can't overlook the fact that he's had to handle an unimaginable tragedy in the loss of Diogo Jota, and it's almost impossible for us to try and quantify just how big an impact that's had. But it would be nonsensical to think that it wasn't having some impact, because what was it 4 months ago? That's no time, is it, when you lose someone that that he was so dearly loved, a teammate and a close friend. So, Slot's been having to deal with the fallout from that. As I said, of course, all the upheaval and so many changes to the squad, the kind of injury blows that he just didn't have to contend with last season. So, he'll know that the expectation he needs to get Liverpool in the Champions League. That being a Champions League club is crucial for Liverpool in terms of FSG's self-sustaining business model. Um, he will know that that is kind of the minimum requirement that he needs to deliver. And I think I think he won't need anyone kind of telling him that. But of course, he won't just because Liverpool are eighth in the Premier League at the moment. That won't be the limit of his expectations. He will believe that, they can clamber back up there and eat into that 8 point lead that Arsenal have got at the moment. He won't be throwing the towel in regarding the title race. As I said, the Champions League, there's absolutely no reason why Liverpool, can't have a proper go at that this season. Obviously, we've got the FA Cup to come. So yeah, I think he's got a huge amount of credit in the bank. I mean, even if Liverpool to miss out on the Champions League, I'm not even convinced that that would lead to the departure of Arne Slot because I just think when you did what he did in his first year in charge and the way that he blew everyone away with the way in which he followed in the footsteps of a legend, I think he's got an awful lot of credit in the bank.
Well, when you look at when I think of Liverpool's form right now in the Premier League, it makes me think of different competition, but it makes me think of PSG's form at this stage of last season in the Champions League when it looked like they might not even make it through to even like the knockout phase of that competition. They started to turn it on. It's a different competition because it's very much about like peaking, whereas like Premier League and domestic titles, I think is more about the consistency and the body of work in your form and everything like that. But I guess is maybe that a bit of a silver lining that they can look at the teams like PSG in the Champions League last season and say like, okay, the campaign looks to be over from the Premier League standpoint, but is that maybe a silver lining that like, there's still months of the season to go and there's still time for things to click?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I think what happened with PSG last season is a great reference point in terms of, as you said, there was a time when it looked like they wouldn't even get out of that revamped league phase. And I remember watching their fight back against Man City, PSG, which kind of seemed to kind of trigger them into life. And then, of course, they were unbelievable in the second half of the season. I mean, and that just shows, doesn't it? Again, like, I remember going back to the start of this season after the transfer window, you had pundits saying, well, that's it, so it's pointless even playing this Premier League season because Liverpool have won the transfer window. They're going to walk the league. No one's going to get close to them. And then, now we're seeing, well, Liverpool are in crisis. Slot is under pressure. It's just knee jerk all the time from one extreme to the other. When we all know from watching top level sport that it's such a long season, and of course Liverpool probably peaked in Europe last season. This time November, December, when they win 7 out of 8 in the league phase. The only reason they lost that one was because he stuck the kids out in that dead rubber against PSV. So yeah, I think, and I also think Slot, part of the reason why he has rotated a lot more this season so far is because he was stung by how Liverpool kind of ran out of gas last season. They were so far ahead in the Premier League, it didn't matter. But, come March, especially that week when they go out the Champions League on penalties to PSG and then lose the Carabao Cup final to Newcastle, he just felt that they were running on empty. And I think he kind of felt that, if only I had rotated more and kept them more, fresher. So it is a different approach this time around, and of course, winning 7 out of 8 last season in the league phase didn't do Liverpool any favours because they end up with such a difficult last 16 draw. This time around, 3 wins out of 4. They've already got one step really in the knockout stages, and also you'd like to think, that come February, March, when that knockout football, gets underway, that it will be a very different Florian Wirtz that we're watching. It will be a very different Alexander Isak that we're watching. Maybe a different Milos Kerkez as well. Allison, the best goalkeeper in world football, should hopefully be between the sticks by then as well. So um, yeah, I think there's so much football to be played this season. It's been I didn't expect to see Liverpool lose 5 Premier League games by the middle of November. Um, but yeah, it's the idea that anyone would start writing this season off already. That just doesn't that baffles me because this could still be a special season for Liverpool.
And I want to end things with something that I'm sure you're very used to being on the Walk On podcast with Tony Evans. He always asks you at the start of the podcast. I'm going to ask you this at the end of the podcast. And you can take a few minutes if you need for this one because there's so many different things you can probably come up with for this. He asks you for your 3 words. I want to know your 3 words for Liverpool's Premier League campaign thus far.
Oh, well, I was just thinking then of 3 words, throwing it forward rather than looking back. So I was going to go with keep the faith in terms of looking ahead because I know it's been a tough watch at times so far this season, and there's been some pretty brutal setbacks, especially the manner of them with some of the late goals. And the game at Brentford was a real tough watch, wasn't it? And then to have the positivity of beating Villa and Real Madrid, and then for what happened at the Etihad. But yeah, keep the faith because someone's we on the Walk On podcast this week we had a um someone had sent in a voice note saying, do you think we're watching like 2014, 2015 revisited in terms of you had the heights of 13, 14 with Suarez and Sturridge flying and coming so close to winning the league, and then Liverpool fall off a cliff the next season. And like my response to that was, well, the biggest difference is look at the personnel. Liverpool fell off a cliff in 2014 because they replaced Luis Suarez with Balotelli and Ricky Lambert. They spent 20 million pound on Lazar Markovic. This is a very, very different situation. I don't look at that Liverpool squad and think there isn't an abundance of talent there. Yes, I do worry that they're probably a centre back short, and I wish they had Mark Gay on board. But there's a huge amount of firepower there to dig Liverpool out of the hole that they've got themselves into. So yeah, keep the faith.
I think that's an excellent, particularly what like you talked about before when it comes to knee-jerk reactions, and we know fans can definitely be like that with a poor performance. So keep the faith. Before I let you go, James, I know you've been doing a lot of stuff with your book, the Walk On Inside Arnie Slots. For people who might be interested in getting a copy of it, how can they do so?
Thank you. Yeah, yeah. So yeah, Walk On Inside Arnold Slots Liverpool. My first book came out last week, so it should be in all good bookshops, as they say, and available online. I know with the international distribution, it's slightly more complicated than I imagined it would be. I know it's not strictly available in the States, I think until March. And similar, I think, around that time for kind of Australia and New Zealand. But there are ways around that. There's numerous places in the UK that do international shipping. So yeah, if anyone's struggling at all, they can always message me via Instagram or whatever, if or on other social media if they need any help finding it online. But yeah, it's out there at the minute, and yeah, thankfully the feedback's been pretty positive so far. And um, yeah, it was probably the toughest thing I've ever done, really, because it's juggling it with the demands of the day job. But yeah, something that I felt it was just too good an opportunity not to take up, really, to kind of tell the inside story of how Liverpool handled that transition from Klopp to Slot, and how they were able to exceed all expectations because it was a remarkable achievement.
So walk on inside Arnie Slots, Liverpool. James, I really want to thank